Okay, so now let's hear from the panel. Please welcome first our moderator, Alex Mavro, who is our Chief of Operation at the center here. Yeah. The first panel is Dr. Poomjai Nacaskul, who is qualitative models and expertise enterprise analytics at the Siam Commercial Bank. The second is John Casella, who is the partner at PKF Tax and Consulting Service Thailand. And then the third one is Jack Kneeland, who is the Managing Director at Energy and Infrastructure, AWR Lloyd.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. What a story. Not the first time I've seen it, but it's the first time I've seen it lately. And every time, about the third time I've seen it, every time I see it, I go, oh, that too. It's scary. Now, I think what we should do is just start off with a quick introduction, a brief introduction from each of our panelists, so you can know when the floor opens, when we open the floor to questions, you know to whom to direct your question. And we'll begin here with Dr. Poomjai.
It's an honor to be here. Basically, I run quant desk, but it's not like a quant desk at a bank that's usually tied to risk management or financial markets, but it's a general quant desk that looks at all problems in the bank, from retailing, logistics, and so forth. So we're kind of like an internal quantitative consultant, as it were. But prior to my job with the commercial bank, I was spending 14 years with the central bank, and during that time, also working in quantitative modeling side of financial regulation. I came to observe a lot of events, crisis events, notably the subprime crisis. I think that was something that I was very much in the thick of. And so this story is slightly, well, it is very different from the global subprime crisis. It's richer in some way, but it doesn't have the macro context that the subprime crisis does. But it certainly is a very insightful things to discuss tonight.
Well, I've been, I'm managing partner of PKF Thailand. We're the 11th largest accounting network of firms. And so I have a background as a CPA from the audit perspective. Before that, and I came to Thailand in '96. So before that, I worked for 10 years in debt restructuring and bankruptcy reorganization. So of course I know a little bit about those sorts of things. And prior to that, in Canada, I worked at an accounting firm called Arthur Andersen for 4 years. So I fortunately got out about 5 years before Enron, but certainly I have a lot of old friends who were affected by this the events, and it does make me sad to watch the movie and think about how as well as the Enron employees, of course Arthur Andersen employees were affected, about 30,000 of them.
Thank you. And Jack?
So I'm with a company called AWR Lloyd. We're a strategy consulting and financial advisory company that works in the energy, metals, and mining sector here in Thailand and in the region. In that capacity, we work with governments and companies in many of these businesses related to the things you've seen today, from natural gas to energy producers to power companies. I think I can safely say a lot of them, none of them are like Enron. But also, interestingly, in my background, I started out in Thailand working for the non-government organization sector. I've spent some time working for the government, so I worked for USAID, but it was a US government agency. I've also spent some time working in banks and now on the consulting side. So while I don't have quite the insight from the internal side that John does, I think I have quite an interesting macro perspective on this, and certainly think it's an interesting story and look forward to discussing it.
Okay, I'd just like to, I'll ask one or two questions and then we'll open it to the floor so we can just get things rolling here. Who would you say was the smartest guy in the room? And why? Why would you call him that? Or her?
Well, I'll start with a surprise answer and say it's probably Jim Chanos, the short seller who is featured as the one who's tipped off the Forbes reporter. Well, I don't think he's actually the smartest guy in the room, he's probably the cleverest, because as much as he's portrayed as the good guy in the story, or one of the good guys, it's very clear he had a short position, he was betting against Enron, wanting it to be bankrupt, and that's what he does, wants other companies to be bankrupt, and is tipping off Forbes in order to destroy the share price, and he probably came out of this very, very well.
Well, that's surprising. That he would rate as the smartest guy in the room. I tell you what, when I saw this, I thought it might be the janitor. Somebody who was not able to get involved, you know, or who saw it and just kept it on mind. Yeah, would you agree with that, John, that particular gentleman?
Yeah, I definitely, the one person that seemed not to buy into the hype, you know, there weren't very many smart people in that room, but a lot of clever people, nonetheless, and I think often it's clever that wins the confidence of people, you know, so there were a lot of those, and as I say, it's there weren't too many.
Dr. Poomjai, what was the big question, you know, that the movie opens with? What are they doing in there? What are they doing? How were they making that money?
Well, it's,
If you can explain it to people, if you can explain it to me, you can explain it to anybody.
actually, I think, again, like I mentioned, that I study a lot about the global subprime crisis. It turns out that there's a lot of mechanism at work that can be used to explain how the crisis transpired. But I think the most important thing is to start with the intellectual context of the time. And I think what's happening here really, without being too much on the left side of the table, it's all started with the deregulation further. So I would like to say, not to blame Nancy and Reagan, very nice people, and Thatcher, but it was the apex of that deregulation thinking that set us to the stage today. You know, with Thatcher, Thatcher, Reagan, push for deregulation. Now, the mechanism can be explained. I don't want to take too much time, but there are some flaw in how the deregulation worked. Some of it was due to the fact that it didn't go quite all the way, so the wholesaler could charge free price, but the retailer cannot charge free price, so they could do this ricocheting, which was mentioned in the documentary, just create an artificial shortage and so forth. But essentially, if I would like to echo situations that perhaps you can see happening in Thailand, it's not a pure crook, and it's not a pure policy flaw, but it's a synergy between the policy regime that allows very clever people, and you have to say these are very clever people, to benefit from it. So, in Thailand we have this thing about the above the board corruption. And that's, in a way, is what's happening. You set the stage for deregulation that allows companies to do funny things. The other aspect is not about deregulation per se as it is about accounting standard. So if I may be blunt, it's the collusion between the quote-unquote rule setter. Now, in this case, Arthur Andersen were not rule setter, but they were certainly opinion leaders. If Arthur Andersen said, it's okay, GAAP is not going to question, okay, because they actually, probably much better accountants than from the regulator side. So by Arthur Andersen allowing such thing as the recognition of revenue, I mean, there were other things as well. For example, if I were doing advisory service, you're doing advisory service, you charge on basis of advisory fee, okay? But you don't say, if I advise you to sell a jumbo jet, you don't say you own a jumbo jet and sell it for profit. So you don't mark it as a merchant profit. So there's a lot of around the rule. You would think that all this fraud has to do with people sidescaping the rule, but all the rules were allowed. This mark-to-market accounting was okayed. This merchant model was okay. So in a way, we were all complicit in this. It's quite sad. It's quite sad, but that's the story. The story to say that what was happening was they were certainly, because they have the Bush connection and so forth, and they were certainly influencing the policy table, okay, to set the stage. But certainly, you could say a lot of what they were starting, okay, the beginning phase. The beginning phase was not pure good. It was engineering the system to be in favor of people who are in the position to take advantage of that system. But as the story went on, then you got to the second phase, where a lot of this was not standing up to true economics. So there was going to be eventually some laws, and people with hubris and social standing, they certainly cannot look like they defeat, so they start covering their laws. So it becomes a shame game. You lie, not so much because you want to lie, as because you want to cover your shame. And that's when they start have this tragedy. And I really like, to be honest, I like the sell side guy, but the one that I think had very good insight is the lady, Bethany McLean, because she has a very human touch to it. She sees this is a very tragic story, Jeff Skilling probably had a very clever idea about commoditizing energy, and I think that's a very clever idea. But eventually, when the failure started to catch up with him, then he just turns into basic crooks. But I don't think they started out as crooks.
Yeah, well, that brings up a question I'd like to ask Jack. When do you think it started to all go wrong in the way that Dr. Poomjai just suggested? It started off on sort of on the right track and constructive, actually creating value, and then it just wound up,
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it wasn't all right. It was clever. It was all clever ploy, but it was within the bound. I think that's the whole point. I wasn't saying they were quite ethical.
Yeah,
they were legal, certainly legal in the beginning.
Okay, well, we'll not make Christians or Buddhists out of all of it. Yeah, so it started off on a firm, relatively firm footing, and wound up not being so.
First of all, I agree very much with how Dr. Poomjai just framed the issue. I think this, looking back on this story 20 years and on the other side of the world from now, at the time this seemed unique and unprecedented. I think now with some perspective we see it's probably unique in terms of scale, but it is not at all a unique event. I think this is what happens when human nature meets opportunities to be tricky, and I think to some degree, there's nothing that can ever prevent something like this from happening again. And on that regard, you notice when the California governor, I believe Gray Todd, spoke about stopping these companies, he said Enron, Dynergy, and Reliant. So if Enron wasn't there, this same thing would have happened. Exactly as Dr. Poomjai mentioned, it's a collusion between weak regulators, either intentional or otherwise, and people there to exploit them. And I think it's quite clear in this case that even if Enron didn't exist, somebody, and it's Dynergy, Reliant, maybe others, would have exploited the exact same thing. So the question, when do they cross over into evil, which I think, depending on how you define the word, they clearly did some horrible, horrible things that were unethical, that destroyed people. And probably people in other companies did the same thing. I think the difference with Enron was when it probably all started to go bad, and there was one day in Jeff Skilling's life where he could have walked away and said, all right, I was just a failed businessman. had, all I have is $20 million, I can only buy a small island and a little yacht, and he probably could have walked away. And I think the day at which he said, I'm different, I can violate the rules, I can, whatever it takes, I'm gonna push this to the end, I think is the day that he and others sort of crossed over onto the dark side, as it were.
Well, you know, you mentioned some of the strong points of some of the people, and as I was listening to the movie, I was making notes, and I was thinking of what we tried to pass on to MBAs, and what we tried to encourage our clients to do, and you know, we preach hiring to the culture, and of course they hired to the culture, didn't they? And we preach to, you know, we want you to add value. Well, they thought they were adding value. Of course, we wouldn't look at it that way necessarily ourselves. Promote innovation and change. Well, yeah, they did innovation. I mean, my God, it was quite innovative. They did. So you go down the list, there's all kinds of things that they did well. One of them was leadership. Her leadership, no question about it. Unfortunately, they lead you in the wrong direction. So you can have all these good qualities and still wind up with a mess on your hands. But your point about this could happen again, it could have been somebody else, you know, who would have taken advantage. Let me just throw it back to our last panelist and say, is because of all these things that have been set up to now, is this possibly an indictment of the system of capitalism?
Yes, I mean, I think you can look at human nature and wonder, is it better to deregulate and give give the free markets the ability to regulate themselves or use their innovations to their boast, to their own devices, and as one person said, the free market is very expensive because in this in this instant you could tell, as you know, interesting watching this documentary for the second time because I picked up on some things. The premeditated joy when they did get Arthur Andersen's approval to use mark-to-market. Why would they be so happy except that they could manipulate the situation? And why would Arthur Andersen make those decisions? If they really knew the company well, and I think the decision to give in to the pressure that they were using to argue the point that they should be allowed to use mark-to-market suggests that everybody that was in a position to make a judgment call judged in their own personal interests ahead of the interests of what was correct or ethical. They may have thought, well, we'll be able to use it sparingly, but they didn't use it sparingly. In fact, they used it very aggressively. As well, when Jeff Skilling says, everything I did was in the best interest of shareholders. Well, he was a major shareholder, so it was really in his own personal self-interest. It was not in the best interest of the line, repairman who had put his life savings into his 401ks, and at one point they were valued at $350,000, and he got something like $1,200 at the end. I mean, he was not acting in that person's best interest. So I mean, it is really a huge abuse of power and position that was used there, and premeditated and conscious decisions to manipulate the situation. So,
I have to say, when I heard that statement, that everything I did was in the interest of, I mean, you could justify a lot of evil
Yes, exactly.
with that, You could set fire to your company tomorrow and say, I've done something, this quarter's profits, we're really up now, So you just have to wonder where people are going with their thought processes when they're thinking only of the immediate profit. So, we have questions from the floor. That's what we're here for. Give us your best shot. We're ready to take it on the chin. Sure. The movie
story, I of course knew the story, but I never saw the movie, I never saw the information put together quite that same way. What I now find myself really considering, really wondering about is that history in many ways is not repeating itself. I think we have a situation right now where we have a bunch of people, the smartest men and some ladies in the room, working for the very best interests of the constituencies they serve, being very creative, being very innovative, and but these people, as opposed to being called businessmen, these people are being called central bankers. And I think tools such as quantitative easing and zero interest rates and the crazy things that are being done with the monetary system, I think they started out with good intentions, but I think in a few years' time we're going to be watching another movie very similar to the Enron debacle. Unfortunately, it's going to be the central bank debacle. And I think it's going to be far more destructive than Enron ever was. I'm very, very worried about that. And this movie really is brought it home.
Okay, anybody have a comment?
Let me take that up. I think that's very much my thing. Yes, I think to be honest with you, I'm probably the only person here, very few people that you hear from the central banking side who will actually say that the root of the subprime crisis did not start in California, but it started in the macro imbalance, and a lot of it has to do with the international monetary system that was put in place. So yes, I do take very, very seriously the issue that a lot of things that were being done in good faith, you know, like the dollar system and so forth. It seems to solve a problem at the time, but at the same time, it laid the foundation for the liquidity, the endless liquidity cycle that fueled the housing market and so forth. And in fact, let me just say, just for out of interest, it's very interesting that the central banks look like the good guys, and you hear things like, have you heard of bitcoins and that? Okay. It sounds very shady, okay? But if I had an hour, I would try to convince you that the bad guys are the quantitative easing Federal Reserve, and the engineers of the Bitcoin are the good guys. Okay, but that would take me an hour. But yes, it is something like that. We you know, we're from a small country, central banker. So anything we do that's out of a normative prescription of the West would be looked down very harshly. But when they turn around and do it themselves, you know, basically this is printing money.
Well, let me just ask, let me just ask John, because he mentioned regulation as well, and the free market, as if, you know, I hear free market, I mean, I don't believe there is any such thing as a free market. There are always guidelines, you're always working with a system or structure. But if you believe that a freer market would have maybe prevented or ameliorated the situation, how do you believe that, and how would
That a freer market would
Yes,
have?
yes.
No, I think, you know,
The other way.
The opposite.
Okay.
Because I think that you know, given the freedom, people will you know, use their own devices in which to, in this case, exploit the system. You know,
So there should be more regulation.
well, I mean, what happened afterwards, for example, is then they introduced Sarbanes-Oxley to try to regulate and prevent these things from happening. Now, you know, I don't know whether or not requiring accountants to take more courses would have made a difference. It certainly makes a difference to me every August when I have to get my, you know, continuing professional education hours in, and I give up my last 2 or 3 weekends of August to do that. You know, at the end of the day, I don't think the people at Arthur Anderson who, for example, did sign off on that accounting principle were thinking anything other than if we don't do this, we're going to lose somebody who's, you know, a client that's going to, you know, the loss of which will mean $1 million per week or whatever the number was that they referred to. And so they were motivated by the ability to get away with it and the fear of
Losing the account. Yeah, I think that's quite clear. I think that's what happens when you have that conflict of interest internally. When you're you're giving advice and then evaluating the advice that you're giving. Whoops.
Yeah.
Could we have any other questions?
Can I?
Please?
Well, so I think some of you said some of the actions taken by Enron, at the first it was, most of them are not illegal, right? So, I'm not so knowledgeable, so like the conspiracy and the kind of accounting which they mention like forecasting profit and the PL, it was not illegal.
Well, okay, I think,
Maybe I'll answer that. I mean, they used the, what were considered to be acceptable accounting principles to present their revenues based upon forecasts. But as the example of the project they did in India, where the project was a disaster, it failed, yet they continued to recognize projected hypothetical revenues to make their P&L look very good. Well, that was the application of what they had been allowed to use in a way that was not appropriate, not ethical, and ultimately, to their own advantage. So people turned a blind eye to what better judgment would say was an inappropriate use of a mark-to-market accounting principle. So in fact, Arthur Andersen did deserve to pay the ultimate price. I mean, and when I was there, in our initial training, when I was in my first year, and we were studying for exams and whatnot, and sort of management courses for the future of the firm, there were people inside our firm saying, we run the risk because there's conflicts of interest. And
Even then,
this was in the early 90s, saying that we have to be careful because, if we're going to put in systems and at the same time audit those systems, we have to be very careful that we have to separate those two. These Chinese walls that exist in banks as well, but it's very easy to kind of turn a blind eye to that. And that's what people did in that case. And the greed of one office or one or two offices that didn't want to lose the account that was otherwise paying for their boats or cars or vacations and retirement.
It's big accounts, right? Say $1 billion a day or something?
Yeah.
I think we did right now, but there were fights even
Oh,
like
for
between
sure.
Chicago office and.
Oh, I know there definitely were. In fact, when I was there, Andersen Consulting separated from Arthur Andersen because of those conflicts, and then Arthur Andersen created their own consulting division that again provided technical advice to clients, sometimes conflicted advice, and Enron was letting their own CFO set up companies to which he was totally conflicted. I mean, he was acting CFO and selling assets to a company that he owned. I mean, that's just there's no way you could defend that.
Even then, right? Even before Sarbanes and all that, right?
I mean, some people turn a blind eye in that case. So that's the fraud. I mean, it's an ethical issue because there are codes of conduct, and that's it's not the accounting rules, it's the way in which you apply the rules and the code of conduct that they all ended up going to jail for. Was really breaking the law and their conflicts of interest.
So they broke the law.
They did. Not by,
Eventually,
yeah,
but not at first.
by the use of it in an improper way, essentially.
Let me give you another example, even more drastic. Not only do you have this thing called mark-to-market, you have this thing called mark-to-model. Okay, so you have something that's in your hand. If mark-to-market means how much is it worth, you call the market, how much is it worth? Well, in financial derivatives, which is the industry I'm familiar with, you have this thing called mark-to-model. So how much is this worth depends on a mathematical formula and an assumption. Now, all of this depends on a lot of expertise. If it's done in good faith, the mathematical model would be accurate, would be calibrated, and will be flexible enough to take into account of the contingencies. Unfortunately, it can also be misused. So if I know a lot more math than you do, I know this parameter is not stable, but I will say that it is a stable parameter and tell you so, because by saying this parameter is stable, I am actually influencing the outcome of that calculation. So it is in the fate of the, so it gets down to people, and getting back to the flaw of capitalism, I would like to offer a different perspective. It's not so much that capitalism is flawed, it's that it's not addressing the problem. The problem is, I can't find a better word, it is morality. Capitalism will always be the most efficient way of expediting enterprise, but it's not going to tell you how to take that direction. So if you don't have that moral fiber somehow, then you are always going to get this fight between free market that wants to exploit everything and then regulation that is a police and a cop and robber kind of thing. But is there any way that the business, the self-interest itself, can frame their own interest in the longer term, in a more sustainability kind of mindset, so that they don't have to be vetted, they don't have to be policed, So instead of having the capitalism as a way of empowering greed, and then you have regulators who are probably not paid very well, not many of them, and so forth, trying to play cops and robber with them. Is there any way that the business school, business education, business community can see themselves as a progressive force that, it is in our interest to grow and be very rich and so forth, but in a sustainable way?
Yes, you can have it both ways. The grandfather of capitalism, if you will, Adam Smith, he was more proud of the theory of moral sentiment than he was, of book on the economy. So that's telling. He really thought that was foundational to everything. Somehow we've gone through the centuries, we've let that, there's been a divide there, we've let that happen. We could talk for hours about that, but let's try to, they have one more question on Enron, if there is one. Yes, please.
And is there any significant change in accounting standard as a consequence of this case?
The introduction of Sarbanes-Oxley was to regulate, basically, and it does, it has had a positive impact. I say that some of it was misapplied, and some of it was, let's say, kind of reactionary and rather putting a Band-Aid over the problem. But I think that that was a measure by George W. Bush that, of course, he was central to this whole story as well. So I think I think the points made here today are very interesting and very true. It's a very complicated issue. Whether we're better to regulate ourselves or others to regulate us, and whether or not the accounting standards are up to scratch. The accounting standards have always been up to scratch. It's just whether they use them or how they apply them. Just like the laws of Thailand are very thorough. It's just whether or not the enforcement or the application of those laws are used in the best interest of
I'd just like to ask one last question of Jack. There was somebody mentioned in the movie there that a good trader is a creative trader. Do you think that's still the case today, even in the wake of all this?
I think in reality, it certainly probably is the most profitable trader. It is a creative trader, and somebody who can see things that other people don't see, see value that other people don't see. Obviously, that comes with some very serious limits and serious risks. And I think something that's very, very hard for us from the outside to draw a line where creative is good and creative is bad.
And it doesn't seem like it could have happened to almost any commodity. Like it didn't have to be oil or electricity or anything. Could have been something else, right?
Well, I actually wanted to make a bigger point about regulation earlier. I think at a fundamental level, probably everybody in this room could come to agree that some businesses or some enterprises should be regulated and some shouldn't be. Meaning the government should have choice over a lot of things and we should have choice ourselves over certain things. I don't think any of us would want the government to tell you what to eat for breakfast, or in a lot of ways our relationships who we get married to is a market, and in some places that is arranged. I don't think any of us, or probably most of us, would want to have the government or anyone else choosing who we married, who we ate breakfast. So there certainly are a lot of areas where you don't want regulation, you want freedoms, you want the ability to choose. And that ability to choose drives quality, it drives people to make better products for us. You know, we would never have our mobile phones, our cars, all the things that we value as high quality products if it wasn't for market forces driving what we want. You know, on the other hand, I think there are industries such as healthcare or perhaps energy, provision of water, where it gets a lot more complicated. And I think to some degree in parts of those businesses, or certainly in a lot of aspects of public welfare, you certainly don't want to, like the U.S. has turned over prisons to the public sector, and to me I think that's going much, much, much too far. But I think to some degree it's a question of understanding which markets need regulation and which ones don't. And I think, as Dr. Poomjai mentioned earlier, in the 1980s and 90s, I think the U.S. certainly overreached on deregulation. But I don't think deregulation or a lack of regulation inherently is a bad thing. And I don't think we want everything regulated.
Okay, fair enough. Oh yeah, you want, okay, one last
Well, I
question.
just want to know if I could follow up with John about Sarbanes-Oxley. I used to work for a New York Stock Exchange listed company. I had to fill out my Sarbanes-Oxley questionnaire every quarter. So I'm a little bit familiar with that. My curiosity is that other jurisdictions, Thailand for example, doesn't have a Sarbanes-Oxley. Have there been was this problem and the solution uniquely American? Or have other jurisdictions implemented or always had adequate controls to prevent such a...
No, Sarbanes-Oxley, I think, gets the most publicity per se, but other international financial reporting standards, for example, that are used in the rest of the world, and in fact, very closely mirror the accounting standards in the United States, or U.S. GAAP, have similar requirements. Everything from anti-fraud and money laundering regulations to the way in which you account for everything on the balance sheet and the income statement. So there have been changes outside of the United States. I guess Sarbanes-Oxley just gets more publicity because it was a very politicized measure taken by good old George W. to solve the problem that he in part helped to create.
But is that to say that other jurisdictions had the same problems or the same potential exposures prior to? And that all jurisdictions have reacted in a similar way?
Sure, but I guess the United States certainly did, make it possible for this Enron type of a situation to occur that didn't hit, let's say, more conservative. Thailand's accounting standards are very conservative. Thailand's banking is very conservative. I grew up in Canada. Canada was less adversely affected in 2008, 9, and so on because of those conservative practices, whereas the U.S. had very aggressive measures, and they needed to, in fact, jumpstart or address some of the issues that happened. Whether it be in 2001 when Enron collapsed or 2008 when the subprime issues came up.
Okay, well, we wanted to have about a half-hour exchange, and we've done that.
Could I make one last?
Yeah, okay,
Sorry.
fire away.
There's one point that's I'm kind of wanting to get out. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think one of the most interesting things that may go over our heads in this is there is a huge hero in this story. If you look at Sharon Watkins, the woman who was testifying in court, she walked in and took a giant big job, probably left her old job, walked into a place where everybody was admiring, everyone was worshiping, and had the courage to say that the emperor has no clothes. Imagine the risk and imagine the courage that took. And so I think while we're saying everything else has got moral complexities, I think this one is stellar, clear. That
She's the one I would have picked for the really.
So that was my second choice. And I think, I do want to leave, may I want to revisit that first answer, to leave her off as the hero of the story and leave us all on a positive note.
Great thought. Well, good. Let me just say thank you very much for all our panelists, and we'll hope to have another exciting movie in 2 months.